911, where's your emergency?
I'd like to see if I could get an officer to do a welfare check on my mother. No one we know of has heard from her in quite some time.
It just drew a lot of alarm bells for everybody.
The next steps to take is to obtain that surveillance footage.
It is suspicious. What are they doing with this money?
I was almost in disbelief. It was hard for me to realize that somebody could do this to another human being.
It felt like I couldn't breathe.
Let's start from top. Did you kill her?
"71-year-old Cindy Mudd is exchanging presents with her family at Christmas.
Thank you, Haley.
She gave the biggest bear hugs that you could possibly imagine. She was the perfect grandma in my eyes. I feel like she was made to be a grandma. When we did celebrate Christmas, it was a wonderful day. Nan was a virologist. She loved what she did, and she was pretty miraculous. I loved her for it. My mother was a single mother, and she worked really, really hard to provide for me. And she did a great job.
Dusty, good.
Cindy's loyal dog, Dusty, isn't left out.
Dogs were always part of her life,
Dusty.
but she was a dog lover. I can guarantee that dog was at her side at all times, just like every other pet we've ever had.
Oh, look what we got here. Look at that. That's
Dan started to show signs of dementia and early Alzheimer's. The last half a dozen times that I saw my mom, each time I saw her, there was a definite decline in her mental status. But my mom was funny and strong and kind. You just never think that something like this is going to happen to your family.
MedTech Communications. My name is Jessica Bean, and I'd like to see if I could get an officer to do a welfare check on my mother.
On August 18th, we received a call from an individual who was concerned about Cynthia Mudd, who lived in our Cross Lanes area of Kanawha County.
I've been coming by the house every day for like the last week, and no one's answering. No one we know of has heard from her in quite some time.
I had started going down there every day and just pounding on the door.
The only contact we've had has been with this house guest, and he said, oh, she went away on vacation. My mother doesn't have the means to take a vacation. She doesn't have a car. She doesn't have the money. We don't know what's going on. No one's answering.
Is the house guest still there?
The house guest isn't answering the door if he is.
If they haven't been in contact, it could indicate that there's a very serious problem, and we need to find out as quickly as possible the condition of the individual.
All right, Jessica, I'll get somebody over there to check on her.
Dispatch sends Corporal A.J. Miller to Cindy's house.
So I noticed that the house was in really good shape. The yard was mowed.
Sheriff's office.
I knocked on the residence for over 15 minutes trying to make contact. I could hear a dog barking inside the home. Unless we see somebody that is in need of our assistance, can't open doors that we're not invited inside of. We generally try and look in the windows to make sure that somebody hasn't fallen, but they all had curtains and blinds on them, so I was unable to see inside the residence. I hit the siren to try and get her attention. Still no contact.
Cindy's daughter, Jessica, arrives at her mother's home to speak with Corporal Miller.
I remember meeting Jessica. She could tell me the specifics of her mother's living arrangement with the man that she's had living there.
So who was the person that was living with your mom?
His name is Sam May.
She wanted a partner. She wanted a soulmate. She wanted someone to be with her, like a companion. But my mother's relationship with Sam May felt like something that you would see on Jerry Springer. Sam and my mother were a couple, but he had gotten another female pregnant, Michelle, and moved her into the house. And my mom was taking care of Sam and his girlfriend.
Michelle had resided in the home up until about a year ago.
Do you have Sam's cell number?
I tried calling it over and over this week. It rang once, then nothing.
His telephone was out of service, so you couldn't leave a message. In a missing person complaint, it's imperative to canvass the area to find out when somebody had last seen Mrs. Mudd. The sooner we get that information, the better.
Deputies speak with Cindy's neighbors.
We had run into her neighbor, Lorna.
Excuse me, ma'am. I'm with the sheriff's office. Do you know your neighbor, Cindy Mudd?
Yes, but I've not seen her, not for a while.
It had been at least 3 weeks since she had seen her. Lorna made mention that she had recognized a younger female enter through a window of the residence. When we hear about somebody going through a window, it does create suspicion.
Lorna says the woman she saw enter the house is Sam's ex-girlfriend, Michelle.
They definitely need to be questioned by law enforcement in regard to why they're doing it, what's going on. It's imperative that we make contact with anybody that has had firsthand knowledge of her whereabouts, especially somebody that resides with her.
Who else has been living there?
2 guys, Sam and Arnold.
Who is Arnold?
Sam and Arnold were very good friends. Arnold would be just as important to speak to because if anything had happened, he may very well have either heard or seen something that would be beneficial to our investigation.
Lorna had explained that Arnold worked at a gas station about 1.5 miles from her home. I made contact with the manager of the gas station.
Excuse me, ma'am. I'm with the sheriff's office. I'm looking for one of your employees, Arnold Hiller.
I was advised that he was let go.
You got his cell number?
Arnold's telephone was out of service, so you couldn't leave a message. It's kind of a roadblock.
Kanawha County Sheriff's Office opens a missing persons investigation to find Cindy Mudd. Detective Elford leads the team.
Once all efforts are exhausted in locating her, we put her into NCIC as a missing person. You just gotta go to your next piece of key evidence to hopefully locate her.
Investigators access Cindy's bank records to look for clues that might explain her disappearance.
We got Cindy's banking transactions. Come and have a look.
In looking at the transaction history, I noticed that there had been some ATM withdrawals and a lot of activity on July 20th, 21st, 22nd, and July 26th from a Speedway gas station, which is in very close proximity to Cynthia's residence.
That's a total of $832.94. That's a lot of money.
Those 4 transactions, they were back to back. And from looking at her banking history, it's something out of the ordinary.
Let's check it out.
Going down to that gas station, we want to obtain that surveillance footage.
Show me the footage from the camera on the ATM.
We viewed the footage on July 26th, right at the time of the exact transaction. Our hopes is to see who exactly is using that debit card.
Who's that?
I immediately recognized that person using Cindy's card as Samuel May.
I don't see Cindy. Show me the exterior camera.
We may be looking for Cindy as well, see if she may be waiting for him out in the parking lot. But we see nobody on the footage other than him.
Cynthia had some health issues, so it sounded as if he had become like a caretaker for Cynthia. It wouldn't be unusual for Sam to have Cynthia's card to buy groceries or other necessities for Cynthia.
Cindy's card was used at the same ATM 3 more times.
Let's watch the footage from the dates of the other transactions.
On July 20th and July 21st, I saw that it was Samuel May again, and he arrived at the store on foot. He made the cash withdrawal.
He withdraws $403.50 on both of those days. It was very suspicious.
And he headed back in the same direction of Cynthia Mudd's residence.
No Cindy.
Can you play the footage from July 22nd?
What was interesting about July 22nd was not only was Samuel May the one that used the card at the ATM, but he was also accompanied by another white male. He's wearing a ball cap, shorts, and a maroon collared t-shirt. It was clear that the two men were together. They were communicating. They purchased some snacks together. The male that's with Sam on the surveillance video, he had eyeglasses. He is noticeably shorter and stockier. He's got facial hair. That man with Sam was Arnold Hiller, the friend of Samuel's who lived in the home with them.
Show me the outside camera.
They exit the store together, and then they walk back into the direction of Cindy's house.
Seeing that Sam and Arnold had consistently withdrawn money, it is suspicious. What need did they have for this immediate cash in such large amounts? What are they doing with this money?
They're just getting out as much money as the ATM will allow them. The last time Sam and Arnold were seen were just a few days prior. So in our minds, we have to locate them as quick as possible.
Thank you. We're gonna need a copy of the footage here. All right, thanks.
Cindy's daughter, Jessica, calls Detective Alford with information she learned from Sam's ex, Michelle.
Detective Alford speaking. Hi, Jessica. How can I help you?
I learned from Jessica that her and Michelle had been in contact with each other.
She said that the last time she saw my mother, Cindy, was a month ago. Michelle said she broke into the house. She climbed in through a window, and she said no one's there, so she thinks that he has fled.
Jessica had given her permission to do that to see if she could maybe locate Cindy.
She told me that she had gone to the house because she hadn't heard anything from my mom, and she too was concerned for my mother.
It was Michelle who neighbor Lorna saw climb through Cindy's window. Investigators charge her with no crimes for entering Cindy's home.
It was obviously very important that we find and speak to Michelle. We met Michelle outside of her place of employment. We interviewed her just in our vehicle outside of the Dollar Tree. We asked Michelle about going over to Cynthia's house. She'd been unable to reach Samuel or Arnold by phone, and so she decided to go over to check on them all.
I actually let myself into the house, and I actually went through the window. I expected to find Sam passed out in bed. I was quite shocked to find the house empty. In Cindy's room, there's pillows missing off of her bed, which is weird because she likes pillows.
If she didn't see any signs of a disturbance, what happened to Cynthia?
So what's your gut telling you? My gut's telling me that something bad happened to Cindy.
Michelle reveals that she broke up with Sam a week earlier.
He's been a little agitated. He's been distant, major mood swings. He'll be okay one minute, and the next minute he's angry at everyone. Drunk, he's capable of anything.
If Sam wasn't at Salton Drive, do you have any idea where he'd be at?
I don't, honestly.
Michelle explained that because she shares a child with Samuel. She and Samuel have a tracking app called Life 360. This was very exciting because that could obviously give us GPS locations.
And that just basically shows when it went off in his last location, or?
Yeah, it shows the last time that he was out of the house. That was Tuesday night, and then he went home. Wednesday morning is when Sam turned his phone off. Okay. So that was the last time I know of him being at that location. It's still off. It still says off since 9:44 Wednesday.
Sam turns his tracking app off on August 17th. That's 2 days before Cindy was reported missing. It raises a red flag. Why would he stop sharing his location? 2 days, that's a lot of time. And with the amount of money they were retrieving from the ATM, I'm sure they could pay someone or maybe take a bus and get out of state. So we have to locate them as quick as possible.
Back at the sheriff's office, investigators reanalyze Cindy's banking activity.
At this point in the investigation, the transaction history using Cynthia's card was the only way we had of tracking anybody.
There's new transactions on Cindy's card 2 days ago.
We found a transaction on August 17th, the day Sam's Life 360 was turned off. And that was at the Family Dollar in the amount of approximately $71. We had seen who was using the card in July, but we wanted some video surveillance that would show us who in particular is using it in August.
Can we see the footage from August 17th?
We learned that the Family Dollar does have surveillance cameras, and they provided footage of the transaction from August 17th.
Yeah, played from there.
From the camera that's facing the doors, I'm hoping to see who's using Cynthia Mudd's card.
Stop there.
At 6:07 p.m., exiting the store, we see two white males, one in a camouflage hat and a blue shirt with a gray backpack, and we see another male in a white sleeveless shirt and khaki shorts.
That's Sam and Arnold.
It was a confidence booster and let us know we're moving in the right direction.
Rewind.
We're hoping to see what they're purchasing and also when they're checking out as well.
The two don't seem like they're in hiding. They don't appear nervous. They are chatty. They're just kind of joking back and forth.
They shop around for a little while and they pay with Cindy's card. It's a big moment for us as investigators because we see them still continuing spending Cindy's money and she's still a missing person.
Across town, Cindy's family grow increasingly concerned about her whereabouts.
Hi, Detective Alford? And you heard anything yet?
And the police were keeping me informed and making themselves available to me.
Thank you. Please let me know. Nothing yet.
At one point, it felt like a nightmare. And I was just hoping that I was wrong and that I'd been worrying for nothing.
My fears were pretty dark at that point, but I was hoping maybe she was just sick.
On the following day, after we did the welfare check, a neighbor contacted the sheriff's office about Cynthia's dog.
911, where's your emergency?
Well, I don't know if anything's going on or not, but this lady across the road, she's an elderly lady, she has a dog. Well, it's been out for days, and it's been over my porch eating cat food.
The neighbor thought that was very unusual. She also went with the dog back over to the residence.
I went to the door, knocked on the door, checked on the lady, and nobody answered. I followed the dog because it went around back, and he keeps sniffing at this big old pile of brush and stuff, and he just keeps sniffing and whining.
The dog kept going to this location in the backyard, pawing at the ground. It just drew a lot of alarm bells for everybody. Deputies went and responded to that call.
So I pulled up to the house. I then went over and spoke with the neighbor, Tanya, who was the complainant for this 911 call. I asked her to show me specifically the area of the yard that she was uncomfortable with.
Hi, boy. I'm gonna go have a look.
The dog came with me. He shadowed me over that location. Along the back fence, directly behind the house, there was what looked to be a partially covered pile of wood. I'm a canine handler. I pay a lot of attention to the dog, to how the dog is interacting with the environment. As soon as I got close to that wood pile, the dog laid down on his stomach, looked directly at the side of it, and he whimpered. His behavior completely changed.
See something?
I realized that what was meant to look like a wood pile was actually a stack of other stuff. I peeled part of like a outdoor backyard pool, and I saw what I thought was the side of a chest-style freezer. It was then that it became completely obvious that I was looking at a form of camouflage. There were several screws holding the freezer door shut. That immediately set off some red flags for me. I believed that there was something in the freezer that we needed to get to.
Corporal Ratliff calls for backup.
I receive a call to go to Sultan Drive. So I stop what I'm doing and I drive there. When I walk into the backyard, it definitely appeared like someone wanted to conceal this deep freezer from people seeing it. I think that that dog was letting us know that something was wrong with that area right there. We attempt to open it. We actually use pry bars to get the screws out of the way.
There was a strong odor. I have only ever been able to associate it with death.
We locate this roll of green carpet. We lifted the carpet out of the deep freezer, and it's got nylon rope around it, like somebody had tied the carpet to make it stay together.
Carefully, they started to peel it open little by little.
We're able to see human bones coming out of that carpet and a human skull.
Based on the state of decomposition, this body has obviously been in the freezer much longer than a day.
We believe that the body in the deep freezer is Cynthia Mudd. I was almost like in disbelief, you know. It was hard for me to realize that somebody could do this to another human being.
The medical examiner's office was able to determine that it in fact was Cynthia Mudd.
The autopsy revealed that Cynthia had a fractured rib and a fractured sternum. That information told me that either Cynthia had a very severe accident, whether that be a fall or someone else has caused those injuries.
Due to her being decayed so much, they estimated that she was deceased for at least a month.
Investigators informed Jessica of her mother's death.
My husband and I were on the front porch. The officer started walking up the steps, and I said it before she could say anything at all.
No. No, Mom.
I said, she's dead. And she was.
They didn't tell me exactly how she died. They just told me that they found out that Nan was dead. It felt like I couldn't breathe. I kind of wished it was wrong, and that something so heinous could never happen to someone so special to me.
Investigators secure a warrant to search the home Cindy shared with Sam and Arnold.
We're able to enter the house and start doing an investigation and collecting evidence and possibly see if the crime happened inside the house. When I'm walking through the residence, I'm looking for blood stains, places that, you know, she could have been injured, weapons, anything to tie what happened to her in the deep freezer in that house. We noticed that there was a hole in the wall, which could have been made from physical force or maybe a blunt object. But there was nothing jumping out at us saying that a crime happened inside the house. As we made our way out to the garage area, we located the white nylon rope.
That rope seemed similar to the white rope that was used to wrap around the carpet that was surrounding the body in the freezer.
Whoever did this to Cindy has access to the home and the garage area.
We're really confident that Sam and Arnold most likely had some involvement in her death. Finding Sam and Arnold is very crucial.
Detectives analyzed the latest transactions on Cindy's debit card to try to pinpoint their location.
On August 17th, there was another transaction in Charleston, West Virginia, an ATM withdrawal for $400 cash. That's quite a large amount, and it prompts us to wonder, is the money being used to, pay to stay somewhere? It shifted our focus to at least the Charleston area.
I see Cindy's card was attempted to be used at a motel. The Quality Inn. My mind goes to, they gotta have somewhere to lay their heads. My adrenaline's pumping because I want to talk to these guys. I want to figure out what happened to Cindy.
Detectives head to the Quality Inn motel.
We're from the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office. Have you seen these two men?
We show that clerk some photos, and they remember those two guys, Sam and Arnold.
When'd they check in?
It was confirmed that Samuel May and Arnold Hiller checked in to the motel on August 17th. It's the day before Cynthia Mudd was reported missing.
And that was the day that Sam had turned his location off with Michelle. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that they're hiding.
Are they still staying here?
We learned that Sam and Arnold had checked out of the motel on August 22nd. And this date was interesting because the media had just released that Cynthia's body had been recovered. Sam and Arnold probably got the feeling that the cards were getting ready to fall. They realized they needed to make a move.
It was kind of defeating a little bit, but we had another great piece of evidence. We had the surveillance footage from the hotel.
Okay, play it from there.
The lobby camera provided footage that showed Sam and Arnold checking into that motel on August 17th at 4:29 p.m.
And it appears that Arnold gives his ID for the room and that Sam pays for the room.
In the lobby, their behavior is somewhat unbelievable because something very bad has happened to Cindy. And here's the two people closest to her that probably know what's happened. Yet here they are being seen just kind of casually joking, nonchalant in a motel lobby.
Can you place the footage from the camera in their hallway?
We got really lucky on that particular camera placement. We got really good views of Sam and Arnold.
They appear to leave the room August 22nd at 9:33 a.m. Sam exits the room wearing a backpack, and shortly after Arnold exits the room, he also has his backpack with him. They walk out of the hotel at that point. Seeing that surveillance footage from the hotel, it's unable to really help us on where they were going. I don't know what happened to them at this point. It's very urgent to locate these two now because obviously they know law enforcement is actively looking for them, what's, going through their heads.
Detective Alford speaking.
So on the morning of August 23rd, I received a phone call that Charleston Police Department has Samuel May. We learned he had actually jumped in the river on the 22nd. I don't know if he was just using the river to try to maybe float and travel as far as he could to the next city, but some People had saw him, called 911, so he was in the hospital overnight. That moment, I got that phone call about Samuel May, like I'm excited. I want to be in the interview room with him.
Investigators bring Samuel May back to the sheriff's office for questioning.
We're just here to figure out what happened.
You saw the news, you said, so obviously that's what we want to talk to you about. So just start at the beginning.
And I'm not one to lie.
And Detective Morgan had just come out and you know, just flat out asked him.
Let's start from the top. Say, did you kill her? Did you kill her?
Tom, Cindy?
Yeah.
I did.
When he heard that, we were kind of taken aback from it. Like, wow, like he's ready to talk. He's ready to tell us what really happened.
Arnold and I went out and to the little bar down the road, which I really shouldn't drink, obviously, because I black out. And it's horrifying.
They had gotten drunk and they walked home.
But it was late, and I went straight to bed. And when I got up, you know, Arnold was trying to get me to help her and all that. I mean, and you could tell there had been some damage. And
what kind of damage, Sam?
Some face punches, stuff.
Okay.
I mean, I don't. I mean,
But she wasn't doing real hot.
Exactly.
Were those punches from you? When you blocked out, more than likely?
More than likely.
Oh.
He's just like, yeah, I blacked out. I woke up and she was hurt really bad. It seemed like almost like he didn't really care as much.
Just snapped?
Yeah, I just know. I woke up. I don't even remember getting mad. That's the problem.
I don't believe you blacked out. I believe you knew what happened. He's admitting a little bit, but he doesn't want to go into all that detail because he knows what he did was really horrible. He said that he has assaulted Cindy before, and he's been involved in a few other domestics. We asked him why he hadn't called the hospital whenever Cindy was hurt.
I freaked out. It was all... We were both crazy freaks. Instead of calling the hospital.
It blows my mind that neither one of them called 911.
Didn't matter. And I knew, but she quit breathing on the bed over one of the nights.
We found out that Cindy's death wasn't immediate. It took a few days.
And we checked on her, stuff like that. And, you know, I was so freaked out, I couldn't even, you know, it's a big fear.
He was thinking about himself and not her. He said that after she had passed away, they decided to take her and roll her up in the carpet, in the deep freezer. He kind of went about his normal day.
Sam is charged with the murder of Cindy Mudd, as well as the concealment of her body.
Sam didn't admit to remembering what he did, so we were hoping to ascertain that information from Arnold. So we had put out still images asking for the public's help in locating Arnold. Approximately 2 weeks later, Arnold is located in Beckley and arrested.
We charged Arnold with fraudulent use of someone's debit or credit card. He's placed in a regional jail. We were able to come to an agreement for an interview with Arnold. He tells us that Sam basically steps on her head 4 or 5 times. And when I say step, I mean with force. The deep freezer idea was Sam's idea, and Arnold did assist with disposing of her body. In January of 2023, Arnold Hiller pleads guilty to concealment and disposal of a body.
The fraud charges against Arnold are dropped as part of his guilty plea.
Arnold was sentenced to 1 to 5 years. In August of 2023, Samuel May pled guilty to second-degree murder, and he was handed a sentence of 40 years in a penitentiary maximum.
As part of the plea deal, prosecutors dropped all other charges against Sam. Investigators pieced together the events that led to Cindy's death.
The investigation revealed that Sam had a tendency to be violent. There was reported incidents involving him and Cynthia.
Michelle and Jessica had both said that he's very abusive towards women. One night in early July, Sam and Arnold go out to a bar and drink. When they got back from the bar, Cindy was up in the living room.
According to Sam, he blacked out and doesn't recall exactly what happened. But I would say he was in a fit of rage. He hit, most likely kicked Cynthia, causing a fractured rib and a fractured sternum.
The following day, he realized that he messed up and he needed help, and he knew Arnold would help him. They keep her alive for about 3 days.
They gave her water, trying to sustain her until she eventually died. And then the two of them conspired to hide her body by wrapping it in carpet. And then they put that carpet with Cynthia's body inside of a deep freezer. And took the freezer out to the backyard where they concealed it with the tarp and stacked other objects up around it. When Sam and Arnold were using her debit card at the Speedway in mid-July, they were using it after her death. When they realized that family reported her missing is when they decided to leave the house.
On August 17th, Sam takes off the Life 360 tracking app, and they make it to the Quality Inn. Well, I think it just shows that both of them are very selfish, and, you know, they didn't want to get in trouble for what had happened, whereas, you know, if they had called 911 when she was alive, you know, there's a chance that they could have saved Cindy's life. I don't think there's really a big motive for Sam. I think he's just such an aggressive, like, just a bad person and thought he could get away with it. Cindy's kindness was definitely abused by Sam and Arnold.
CCTV was very helpful in this investigation, actually critical. Some put timelines down.
The surveillance footage in this case was a very big part. I think it would have took a lot longer to resolve if we didn't have the surveillance footage.
It hurts. And there's always that, well, maybe if I'd have just been forceful and, you know, gone in there and just taken her out, that she would finally leave him. And that just never happened. There's a lot of guilt involved. I miss her laugh. I miss the way that she hugs. I don't know where the world goes without Nan. I don't know where it's supposed to go without Nan.
The projection of 30 years into the future is a distance that usually promises absolute forgetting, an expanse of time wide enough to wash away the sharpest edges of any trauma and turn the loudest screams into distant, unreadable murmurs. But the truth does not dissolve under the pressure of 3 decades. It merely waits, buried beneath the changing topsoil of a town that tried its best to rewrite its own history. It is 1996, an unseasonably cold autumn night in a quiet, isolated town where the forest presses too tightly against the borders of the residential streets and the wind carries the distinct, biting scent of impending winter. A girl is walking home, her coat collar pulled up against the chill, her footsteps casting a lonely, rhythmic echo across the wet asphalt. She is minutes away from her front porch, her mind likely drifting to the mundane comfort of a warm meal and a textbook left open on her bed. She turns a corner, stepping into the deep shadow of an oak canopy, and vanished. No sounds of a struggle, no frantic cries cut through the midnight air, no signs of a desperate fight left in the dirt. It was a cold case born in a single, terrifying instant, an absolute erasure of a human life that left behind only a vacuum of unanswered questions and a lingering, toxic paranoia that would quietly consume the community from the inside out for the next 30 years. The initial response was a chaotic, high-intensity scramble characterized by the blinding glare of searchlight beams slicing through the dense treeline and the desperate, overlapping chatter of emergency radio scanners. Police units, K-9 teams, and hundreds of local volunteers swarmed the area, where her footsteps had abruptly stopped, their boots churning the pristine autumn mud into a jagged, treacherous landscape of false leads and crushed evidence. They found nothing, no dropped keys, no fiber from her coat, no chemical trace of an accelerant or a struggle. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the mist that rose off the damp forest floor every night, leaving the detectives to stare into a profound, terrifying void. The community, once anchored by the predictable, comforting routines of a small-town existence where doors were left unlocked and children played unsupervised until dusk, shattered instantly into 1,000 isolated pieces. Trust became a luxury no one could afford. Neighbors glanced across their neatly trimmed hedges with cold, calculating suspicion, wondering if the friendly face who had helped them shovel snow or shared a barbecue was the monster who had swallowed the girl in the dark. Forensic teams worked with an agonizing, meticulous focus inside the temporary command center established at the edge of the woods, cataloging the meager fragments of data they managed to scrape from the periphery of her known path. They collected every tire track, dusted every fence post within a 2-mile radius, and recorded hours of static-filled interviews with anyone who had been within the county lines that night. But the mid-90s was a primitive era for forensic science, a time when genetic tracking was an emerging, imperfect tool and digital surveillance was virtually non-existent. The primitive tools of the time were simply incapable of reading the microscopic signatures left by a professional, highly disciplined predator who had planned his movements with the precision of a military operation. Every potential breakthrough evaporated upon closer inspection. Every suspicious vehicle tracked across state lines proved to be a dead end. Every anonymous tip phoned into the hotline was revealed to be the product of cruel pranksters or the frantic, desperate imagination of a terrified populace. The lead detective, a man who would spend the rest of his life tracking the ghost of that night, watched the case file expand into a monolithic, multi-volume testament to his own inability to protect the town. Years bled into decades, the vibrant, urgent colors of the missing person posters fading into the washed-out, sepia tones of public indifference and institutional neglect. The investigation was officially reassigned to the Cold Case Unit, a bureaucratic euphemism for a vault where unsolved tragedies were sent to be buried beneath the endless influx of new, more immediate horrors. The town attempted to heal its wounds by pouring concrete over its memories, expanding the suburbs, tearing down old structures, and pretending that the vacancy at the end of the street didn't exist. But the shadow remained, an invisible, high-tension current that vibrated low and constant beneath the surface of their daily lives, affecting the way parents raised their children, the way strangers were treated at the local diner, and the way the wind sounded when it blew through the old oak canopy at midnight. Every major milestone, the turn of the millennium, the transition into the digital age, arrived with the lingering, bitter realization that someone, somewhere, was walking among them, breathing the same crisp autumn air, and holding a secret that had cost a family their entire future. Then came the year 2026, a milestone that marked exactly 30 years since the girl had walked into the dark, a year that arrived with no expectation of a resolution, no pending forensic reports, and no new witnesses waiting to step forward. The breakthrough didn't happen because a modern laboratory discovered a microscopic strand of DNA on an old piece of fabric, nor did it happen because a piece of heavy machinery unearthed a hidden graveside in the deep woods. It began with a phone call, dialed from a sterile, fluorescent-lit motel room on the other side of the country, a voice crackling with the dry, hollow resonance of a man who had finally run out of places to hide from his own reflection. The prime suspect, an individual who had been questioned 3 times in the initial months of the 1996 investigation but had slipped through the net due to a carefully constructed, ironclad alibi, was on the other end of the line. He wasn't bargaining for a lighter sentence, nor was he attempting to deflect the blame onto a fictional accomplice. He was surrendering, his ego and his defenses completely crushed beneath the unbearable, multi-decade weight of his own long-buried guilt. The confession was a systematic, cold-blooded dismantling of a 30-year illusion, a narrative that wove the disjointed, chaotic fragments of the 1996 file into a single, terrifying masterpiece of premeditated violence. Seated in an interrogation room that felt small and heavy with the sudden, suffocating presence of the truth, the suspect spoke in a flat, mechanical monotone that lacked any trace of human emotion or superficial remorse. He described the hunt, the weeks spent mapping her routine, the precise layout of the street corner beneath the oak canopy, and the exact method he used to ensure that her disappearance would be absolute, instantaneous, and silent. He provided details that had never been released to the public, descriptions of items she carried that had been intentionally omitted from the case files, and a coordinates-based map that led directly to the final resting place of her remains, buried deep within a section of the forest that search teams had walked past 100 times. The detectives listened in an absolute, deathly silence, their pulses hammering in their ears as they realized that the monster they had been hunting across the country for 3 decades had been a man living a perfectly ordinary, quiet life, just 2 hours away from the crime scene. News of the confession and the subsequent arrest hit the town with the force of a delayed, high-impact detonation, tearing through the modern, polished facade of 2026 and exposing the raw, unhealed trauma of 1996. The headlines screamed across digital platforms with an aggressive, dawn-dap rhythm that left the community reeling in a state of collective vertigo. Justice after 30 years. Cold case solved as prime suspect confesses. The names, the faces, and the imagery of that long-ago night were suddenly thrust back into the center of public consciousness, forcing a generation that had tried to forget to confront the reality of their shared history. Neighbors who had grown up in the shadow of the mystery gathered on street corners, their conversations sharp, frantic, and filled with a nauseating mix of relief and horror. The realization that the case was solved didn't bring an immediate sense of peace. It brought a visceral, shocking clarity that exposed just how deeply the lie had been integrated into the very fabric of their town. They were forced to look at the man who had maintained a facade of absolute innocence for 30 years, a man who had watched them grieve, watched them panic, and watched them suspect one another, all while carrying the definitive record of her death in his own head. The recovery operation in the deep woods was conducted under a gray, leaden sky that seemed to mirror the somber, exhaustive reality of the breakthrough. Forensic anthropologists and recovery teams worked within a cordoned-off grid, their movements slow, reverent, and precise as they excavated the site indicated on the suspect's hand-drawn map. With every layer of earth removed, the past came rushing back into the present until they finally uncovered the physical, undeniable proof of his confession, the structural remnants of a life that had been violently interrupted 30 years ago. The item recovered, a small personal trinket that had been mentioned in the initial missing person reports but never found, was lifted from the dirt with a level of care that bordered on the religious. It was the final, indisputable anchor of the investigation, the piece of physical reality that turned his verbal confession into a legal fortress from which there was no escape. The detective stood at the edge of the pit, the cold wind rustling the yellow police tape, realizing that the long, painful journey that had begun in the chaos of 1996 had finally reached its physical, definitive conclusion. The legal proceedings that followed functioned as a formal, public autopsy of a life built entirely on a foundation of calculated deceit. The courtroom was packed to absolute capacity every single day, the gallery filled with the surviving relatives, the retired officers who had never let the case go, and a new generation of citizens who wanted to bear witness to the end of the town's most enduring nightmare. The suspect sat at the defense table, his physical form looking diminished, hollowed out by the reality of his exposure, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor as the prosecution read his own words back to him. The defense team didn't attempt to challenge the science or the validity of the confession. They simply stood by as the machinery of the law executed its slow, grinding, and inevitable function. Each day brought a new wave of graphic, heartbreaking detail that laid bare the sheer, unadulterated malice of the act, turning the trial from a simple presentation of guilt into a formal, societal accounting of the devastation he had inflicted on an entire community. When the final sentence was delivered, a structural guarantee that he would spend the remaining days of his life behind the concrete and steel of a maximum security cell, the reaction in the room was not an explosion of cheers, but a profound, universal exhale that felt as heavy as a stone falling into a deep well. The family of the victim held each other in the front row, their faces lined with the exhaustion of a 30-year march through the dark, their tears reflecting a complex, agonizing mixture of hard-won peace and permanent, irreparable loss. The gavel's final strike didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the closing of a massive, rusted door on a portion of their lives that could never be restored. The justice served was absolute, legal, and final, but it was also an explicit reminder of everything that had been stolen. The milestones never reached, the adult life never lived, and the 3 decades of joy that had been replaced by the suffocating, grinding reality of an open-ended trauma. The town, left in the quiet aftermath of the trial as the media trucks packed up their gear and the digital headlines faded from the front pages, entered a new, unfamiliar phase of its existence. The vacancy at the end of the street was no longer a mystery, the old oak canopy no longer held a secret, and the files in the basement of the precinct were finally stamped with the clinical, definitive label of closed. But the echo of the unresolved decades still lingers in the architecture of the neighborhood, a permanent, subtle shift in the way the community views its own safety and its own history. They have their answers, they have their closure, and they have their justice, but they also carry the permanent, haunting knowledge of how easily the dark can hide in the light of the ordinary. The cold case is solved, the monster is contained, but the memory of the girl who walked into the autumn mist of 1996 remains a permanent, quiet fixture of the local landscape, a reminder that the truth will always demand to be heard, no matter how long the silence tries to protect the lie. The echo of that confession inside the interrogation room did not dissipate into the sterile walls. It expanded, traveling outward like a high-velocity shockwave through the digital infrastructure of 2026. The technical data, the audio files, and the verified transcripts were instantly uploaded to the federal database, turning a sudden breakthrough into a matter of absolute, unassailable legal record. Detectives who had inherited the 1996 file sat in the dimmed light of the precinct, their eyes bloodshot from a 36-hour marathon of verification, watching the waveform of the suspect's voice jump and stutter on the monitors. He was describing the physics of a crime that had been frozen in time for 3 decades, giving a clinical, step-by-step account of how he had manipulated the geography of the town to execute a perfect, frictionless abduction. The cold precision of his memory was the most terrifying element of the recording. He remembered the exact temperature of the wind, the sequence of the traffic lights, and the specific frequency of the static on his car radio as he waited in the shadows beneath the old oak canopy. Outside the station, the modern landscape of the suburb began to feel surreal, its polished, safe exterior punctured by the sudden resurgence of a 30-year-old horror. Investigative teams were dispatched to the recovery site, their convoy of black SUVs cutting through the early morning fog with a silent, grim urgency. They were navigating by the suspect's hand-drawn schematic, a map that used old landmarks, a demolished barn, a dried-up creek bed, a logging trail that had long since been choked by modern overgrowth. The geography had changed, buried under 30 years of topsoil, concrete, and programmatic suburban expansion, but the coordinates remained absolute. The forensic anthropologists moved into the brush with a quiet, reverent focus, carrying specialized radar equipment and ground-penetrating arrays designed to see through the layers of time. They were looking for a disturbance in the earth that had occurred when Bill Clinton was in office, a microscopic anomaly in the soil density that would confirm the final destination of the girl who had vanished from the corner of the street. The news of the recovery operation leaked to the press within hours, triggering a secondary wave of media frenzy that turned the perimeter of the forest into a high-stakes staging area for national news networks. Satellite trucks packed the narrow shoulder of the highway, their generators humming a low, constant vibration that seemed to agitate the damp air. Anchors stood before the tree-line, their voices dropping into that specific, sensational cadence reserved for historical tragedies brought back from the dead. The town was suddenly trapped in a time warp, its current prosperity and high-tech corporate parks juxtaposed against the grainy, low-resolution television footage of 1996 that was being broadcast on a continuous loop across every digital platform. Passers-by stopped their vehicles along the road, staring into the dense woods with a mixture of morbid curiosity and a deep, ancestral dread, realizing that the truth they had avoided for 3 decades was currently being excavated just a few hundred yards from their daily commute. Inside the cordoned-off grid of the forest, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, scraping sound of flat-edged shovels slicing through the wet clay. The recovery team worked with a level of care that bordered on the ritualistic, treating every root, every stone, and every layer of decaying autumn foliage as a potential page in a narrative of violence. They were descending into the past, centimeter by centimeter, filtering the dirt through wire screens to catch the smallest fragments of reality. At the 3-foot mark, the soil density shifted, revealing a distinct change in coloration that matched the suspect's description of the excavation site. The lead anthropologist dropped to her knees, switching from a shovel to a small wooden pick and a soft bristled brush, her movements slowing to a crawl as the first structural evidence of the crime began to emerge from the darkness of the earth. The object that broke through the surface of the clay was a small, synthetic button, its faded plastic surface holding a tiny thread of blue nylon, the exact material of the coat the girl had worn on that unseasonably cold night in 1996. It was a moment of profound, suffocating clarity for the investigators standing at the edge of the pit. The button wasn't just evidence, it was an anchor, a physical manifestation of a life that had been violently interrupted and hidden away while the world above continued to move, innovate, and forget. The forensic photographer moved into position, the sharp, artificial flash of the camera illuminating the dark hollow of the excavation, capturing the precise spatial relationship of the artifact to the surrounding earth. This was the definitive link that the prosecution needed, the incontrovertible proof that would turn the suspect's verbal confession into an unbreakable legal cage from which his defense team could never escape. As the afternoon light faded into a cold, leaden gray, the recovery team uncovered the remaining elements of the site, working under temporary halogens that cast long, theatrical shadows across the forest floor. The process was grueling, emotional, and intensely technical, requiring the team to maintain their professional detachment while handling the physical remnants of a town's collective nightmare. Every artifact was bagged, barcoded, and logged into the electronic chain of custody with a level of security typically reserved for high-value state secrets. They were rebuilding the final moments of a 17-year-old life, turning the chaotic mystery that had baffled a generation of detectives into a sterile, organized collection of court-admissible data points. When the final transport vehicle backed up to the edge of the woods, the officers stood at attention, their heads bowed as the containers were loaded into the back, signaling the end of her 30-year isolation in the dark. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, the legal machinery was moving with an aggressive, dawn-dap rhythm to ensure that the suspect's detention was permanent and unassailable. Prosecutors were drafting the formal indictment, a document that wove 30 years of circumstantial reports, old witness statements, and the fresh, devastating data from the interrogation room into a single, cohesive narrative of guilt. They were operating under the intense scrutiny of the National Justice Department, knowing that any procedural error, any gap in the chain of custody, or any technical misstep could provide the defense with the leverage needed to challenge the validity of the confession. The atmosphere in the law offices was thick with the scent of stale coffee and electronic heat, the printers running continuously as volumes of historical data were cross-referenced with the new forensic realities. The defense attorney assigned to the case was a veteran of the state's high-profile court system, a man who understood that his role was not to argue for innocence, but to manage the damage of an absolute exposure. He met his client in the sterile, heavily fortified visitors' room of the county jail, the table between them the only barrier in a space defined by reinforced concrete and high-definition surveillance cameras. The suspect sat slumped, the manic, controlling energy that had allowed him to maintain his deception for 30 years having completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, aging shell of a man who looked crushed by the gravity of his own admission. The attorney reviewed the preliminary forensic reports, his eyes skimming over the DNA confirmations and the structural logs from the recovery site, realizing within minutes that there was no legal strategy, no technical loophole, and no procedural technicality that could withstand the momentum of the state's case. The public reaction to the recovery of the remains was a complex, visceral mixture of raw fury and collective mourning. A spontaneous vigil materialized at the corner of the street where she had vanished, the exact spot beneath the old oak canopy where her journey had been violently cut short. Hundreds of candles flickered against the damp evening chill, their pale, warm light illuminating photographs of the girl that had been extracted from old high school yearbooks. People who had never known her, citizens who had moved to the town decades after the disappearance, stood alongside gray-haired classmates who had spent their entire adult lives wondering what had happened to their friend. The atmosphere was heavy with a profound, nauseating realization that the safety they enjoyed in 2026 was a landscape built over a foundation of unresolved horror, a realization that changed the way they looked at the trees, the streets, and the quiet spaces of their neighborhood. The local police department, which had carried the stigma of the 1996 failure for a generation, held a live, globally broadcast press conference to announce the formal filing of first-degree murder charges. The chief of police, a man whose predecessor had retired in frustration over the case, stood before a wall of micro-cameras, his voice steady but thick with the gravity of the announcement. He did not present the breakthrough as a triumph of modern policing, but as a long-overdue debt that was finally being paid to a family and a community that had been broken by the silence. Behind him, a digital display showed the timeline of the investigation, 30 years of dead ends, false leads, and thousands of hours of documentation, all leading down to the definitive, clinical conclusion of the current date. The presentation was brief, sharp, and on-dap, leaving no room for media speculation or sensationalized questions from the floor. As the night settled over the county, the media vans began to dim their lights, their live broadcasts shifting to late-night recaps of the day's shocking events. The town attempted to return to its normal rhythm, but the air felt different, charged with the heavy, historical weight of a mystery that had finally been stripped of its power to haunt. The file in the basement of the precinct was still open, the final signatures and court orders awaiting the formal trial, but the psychological vacuum that had existed since 1996 had been filled by the cold, hard reality of the truth. The town was no longer waiting for a monster to be identified. They were waiting for a trial to begin, a transition from the terrifying fluid dynamics of a cold case to the rigid, predictable architecture of judicial finality. The remaining members of the girl's family sat in the quiet of their living room, the televisions turned off, the digital notifications muted, the world outside their door rendered completely irrelevant by the magnitude of their private resolution. They were holding the original missing person flyer from 1996, the ink faded, the paper fragile along the folds where it had been opened and closed thousands of times over the last 30 years. The face of the 17-year-old girl smiled back at them from a time before the internet, before the town changed, before their lives were permanently split into the before and the after. The justice that was unfolding down the street at the courthouse could not restore her youth, could not return the decades of missed birthdays, and could not erase the grinding, everyday ache of her absence, but it had finally removed her name from the lists of the forgotten, anchoring her memory in the permanent, undeniable light of the truth. The transition from the frantic forensic recovery in the deep woods to the structured, sterile environment of the pretrial phase moved with the heavy, unyielding momentum of a closing vault door. Inside the county courthouse, a monolithic structure of granite and reinforced glass that stood as the architectural embodiment of institutional finality, the legal teams began the arduous process of converting the raw, emotional debris of a 30-year-old crime into a streamlined, bulletproof prosecution. The suspect, now formally identified in the public record as the architect of the 1996 disappearance, was transferred to a high-security holding facility, his daily existence reduced to a monochromatic routine of concrete walls, fluorescent lights, and the distant, metallic clang of sliding iron gates. The controlling, meticulous personality that had allowed him to maintain an illusion of innocence while walking the very same streets as the victim's family had completely shattered, leaving behind a hollowed-out, rapidly aging individual who seemed to be suffocating under the sudden, absolute exposure of his true nature. The lead prosecutor, a woman whose career had been defined by her clinical, unemotional approach to complex criminal syndicates, spent her nights in the dimmed offices of the Justice Department, surrounded by towering walls of historical data. The 1996 file was no longer a collection of loose papers and speculative theories. It had been digitized, cross-referenced, and augmented by the devastating physical realities extracted from the forest floor. She pored over the original audio recordings of the suspect's preliminary interviews from the 90s, matching the subtle, calculated hesitations in his voice with the precise geographic coordinates of the recovery site. The contrast between his past arrogance and his current capitulation was a study in the psychological decomposition of a predator. He had believed that the passage of 3 decades had granted him a permanent immunity, that the decay of the topsoil and the expansion of the modern suburb had effectively buried his errors beneath the weight of national indifference, but he had failed to calculate the persistence of a system that refuses to let a stolen life go unavenged. Outside the courtroom, the town was undergoing a quiet, internal realignment as the initial shock of the confession began to settle into a deep, pervasive sense of historical vertigo. The local high school, where the victim had been a vibrant, universally loved presence before her sudden erasure, became the focal point for a generation of residents who were forced to reevaluate their own youth. Gray-haired classmates who had spent 30 years looking over their shoulders, wondering if the danger was a passing stranger or a permanent resident of their neighborhood, gathered in small, hushed groups at local diners and community centers. They were looking at old photographs with a new, terrifying lens, realizing that the suspect had been a peripheral figure in their social circles, a man who had attended the same town halls, shopped at the same markets, and watched the search parties with the detached, analytical gaze of a vulture observing its own handiwork. The betrayal felt systemic, a violation of the collective trust that had once allowed the community to view its quiet, tree-lined streets as a sanctuary from the harsh realities of the wider world. Inside the forensic laboratory, the final analysis of the artifacts recovered from the deep woods was nearing completion under conditions of absolute security. Technicians worked under the glare of high-powered microscopes, their movements slow and deliberate as they documented the structural integrity of the synthetic button and the microscopic nylon fibers that had survived 30 years of subterranean pressure. They were performing an autopsy on a frozen moment in time, translating the chemical signatures of the soil and the degradation of the synthetic fabrics into a definitive chronological timeline that would lock the suspect into the exact hour of the crime. The data was compiled into a series of high-definition digital arrays, transforming the raw, tragic reality of the recovery site into a collection of pristine, indisputable charts that would leave the defense with no room for obfuscation, no opportunity for technical challenge, and no path toward a compromised plea agreement. The defense team, fully aware that they were standing in the path of a Category 5 legal storm, attempted to construct a strategy that focused entirely on mitigating the finality of the sentence. They reviewed his medical history, interviewed distant acquaintances from his youth, and searched for any evidence of cognitive decline or psychological fracturing that could be used to explain the sudden, catastrophic collapse of his 30-year deception. But their efforts felt hollow, a series of desperate, bureaucratic maneuvers that vanished when contrasted with the cold, mechanical precision of his own tape-recorded confession. The suspect sat during their brief consultation sessions in total, unresponsive silence, his eyes fixed on the reinforced metal table, as if he were already listening to the final, rhythmic countdown of his remaining days of freedom. He had run out of narratives, run out of alibis, and run out of the psychological energy required to maintain the lie that had been the central axis of his adult life. As the date of the formal arraignment approached, the media presence in the county shifted from the chaotic, sensationalized energy of the initial breakthrough to the disciplined, highly strategic posture of a national event. Major networks established permanent broadcasting booths on the plaza outside the courthouse, their high-intensity floodlights turning the gray stone facade into a harsh, exposed stage. The town found itself at the center of a national discourse on the nature of justice, forensic science, and the hidden dangers that lurk within the mundane structures of suburban normalcy. The cold case label was officially retired in the lower thirds of the news screens, replaced by a permanent, aggressive heading that sounded like a drumbeat of inevitable doom: the 1996 unmasking. Every citizen who walked past the cameras did so with their head down, eager to escape the glare of a spotlight that had turned their quiet home into a cautionary tale for the rest of the country. The remaining members of the victims' families spent this interim period in a state of absolute seclusion, their home transformed into a fortress protected by local authorities from the intrusive curiosity of the press. They were not preparing for a trial. They were preparing for an encounter with the reality that had been hidden from them for 10,000 days. The mother, a woman whose face had become the enduring public symbol of the town's long-standing grief, sat in her living room, her eyes tracing the contours of the small box that held the few personal items the detectives had returned to her, the small trinkets that had survived the dark of the forest. There was no anger in her demeanor, only a profound, oceanic stillness, the quiet of a survivor who has finally reached the end of an exhausting, multi-decade migration through a desert of unanswered questions. She knew that the legal proceedings down the street would not bring back the 17-year-old girl who had walked into the autumn mist, but it would finally afford her daughter the dignity of a definitive story, an unassailable record that she had existed, that she had been loved, and that her absence had mattered. The final night before the arraignment arrived with a silent, freezing rain that coated the town in a thin layer of ice, turning the streets into a mirroring landscape of cold, fractured light. Inside the precinct, the investigative team gathered for their final strategy briefing, the atmosphere in the room thick with the scent of industrial cleaner and stale tobacco. They checked the digital chain of custody logs one last time, ensuring that every byte of data, every forensic slide, and every transcript was perfectly aligned for presentation to the magistrate. They were the architects of a 30-year resolution, a group of professionals who had stood in the silence until the truth finally spoke back to them, and as they looked out the window at the dark, frozen town, they knew that the morning would bring the beginning of the final, irreversible reckoning. The lie was dead, the secret was out, and the machinery of the law was primed to execute its slow, grinding, and absolute function in the light of an undeniable truth. The morning of the formal arraignment arrived under a sky that looked like a sheet of unpolished steel, a cold, heavy canopy that matched the grim, unyielding energy of the crowd gathering outside the county courthouse. By 6 a.m., the plaza was a sea of black umbrellas, heavy winter coats, and the intense, synthetic glare of television floodlights that turned the falling sleet into streaks of white fire. Local authorities had established a double layer of steel barricades along the perimeter of the entrance, their movement swift, quiet, and hyper-focused as they managed the influx of hundreds of citizens demanding access to the gallery. The atmosphere was charged with a visceral, suffocating tension. This wasn't just a procedural step in a standard criminal investigation, but the official opening of a historical ledger, the moment the town would finally look into the eyes of the man who had stolen its peace in the autumn of 1996. Inside the building, The corridors were a maze of hushed whispers, the sharp click of leather shoes against the marble floors, and the heavy, rhythmic hum of building ventilation systems trying to fight the damp chill brought in from the streets. Detectives who had lived with the weight of the file for half their lives stood in small, stoic groups near the elevators, their faces set in hard, unreadable lines. They had spent decades chasing phantom leads, analyzing contradictory statements, and staring at the smiling face of a 17-year-old girl whose life had been violently paused, and now they were minutes away from witnessing the formal, judicial implementation of the truth. The file folders they carried weren't just legal documents. They were the physical manifestation of an entire generation of frustration, dedication, and an uncompromising refusal to let a predator write the final chapter of a town's history. The suspect was brought into the courtroom through a private, heavily fortified subterranean tunnel, the sound of his shuffling footsteps and the low, metallic jangle of his ankle chains preceding his entrance into the room like a drumbeat of inevitable doom. When he stepped through the security door, a collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the gallery, a sound that felt like a localized tear in the fabric of the room's atmosphere. He was dressed in the standard, high-visibility orange uniform of the county holding facility, his physical form looking incredibly diminished, almost hollowed out, as if the sudden, total exposure of his true nature had caused his physical structure to collapse inward. The manic, calculated arrogance that had allowed him to maintain an alibi for 30 years was gone, replaced by the vacant, defeated posture of a man who realized that the walls of his deception had permanently turned into the walls of his cage. He sat at the defense table between his two attorneys, his head bowed, his eyes fixed firmly on the polished wood surface, as if looking up would cause him to dissolve under the intense, judgmental gaze of the public. Across the aisle, the prosecution team sat in a state of pristine, military efficiency, their desks organized with a series of black binders, high-definition digital tablets, and the physical artifacts that had been recovered from the deep woods just days prior. The contrast between the two sides of the courtroom was absolute. One side represented the total, chaotic decomposition of a lifetime of lies, while the other represented the cold, mechanical, and unstoppable momentum of modern forensic justice. The entry of the magistrate into the room brought a sudden, absolute silence that felt heavier than the stone walls of the courthouse itself. The judge, a woman whose reputation for absolute legal precision was legendary across the state, adjusted her robes, looked over the bench, and fixed her eyes on the suspect with a cold, analytical focus that left no room for performance or procedural delay. She began the session not with a grand statement, but with a dry, clinical reading of the charges, her voice echoing off the high, wood-paneled walls with a flat, Don-Dap rhythm that sounded like the steady closing of a vault door. State versus the defendant. Count 1, first-degree murder. Count 2, kidnapping. Count 3, aggravated kidnapping. Each syllable was a hammer blow against the illusion of his innocence, a formal, public strip mining of the normalcy he had stolen from the community. The prosecutor stood to read the state's preliminary statement, a document that did not rely on emotional appeals or dramatic rhetoric, but on the raw, unassailable language of forensic science and verified logistics. She walked the court through the timeline of that unseasonably cold night in 1996, tracing the victim's final path from the high school locker rooms, past the athletic fields, and down to the specific, dark corner beneath the old oak canopy. As she spoke, she activated a high-definition monitor facing the jury box, displaying a digital rendering of the geographic coordinates extracted from the suspect's own confession, juxtaposed against the microscopic analysis of the synthetic button and the blue nylon fibers recovered from the clay matrix of the forest floor. The detail was devastating, a clinical reconstruction of an act of violence that had been hidden under 3 decades of topsoil and environmental decay. The prosecutor's voice never wavered, maintaining a flat, professional delivery that made the horror of the details feel even more visceral, more permanent. She described the suspect's methodology, the weeks of stalking, the precise calculation of the street's blind spots, and the absolute, instantaneous nature of the abduction, revealing a level of premeditated malice that left the gallery in a state of stunned, nauseating clarity. This wasn't a crime of impulse or a tragedy born of a sudden escalation. It was a surgical, highly disciplined exercise in predation that had been planned with the cold intelligence of a machine. The defense attorney, when his turn came to address the court, did not attempt to challenge the biological markers or the validity of the audio-recorded confession. He understood that his role had shifted from an advocate for acquittal to a manager of an absolute, catastrophic exposure. He spoke in quiet, measured tones, focusing his presentation entirely on procedural compliance, the suspect's current medical status, and a formal request for a preservation order regarding the digital evidence logs. His performance was that of a realist who recognized that the state had built a legal fortress from which there was no escape, a structure where every brick was reinforced by the undeniable laws of molecular biology and the suspect's own self-incriminating statements. The suspect's response to the magistrate's formal inquiry regarding his plea was a sound that barely carried to the microphones on the defense table, a low, dry, and raspy declaration of guilty that seemed to drag the remaining air out of his lungs. He didn't look up as he spoke the word. He didn't offer an explanation, a defense, or a superficial gesture of remorse. The word simply fell into the room like a heavy stone into a deep, stagnant well, its ripples moving through the gallery and out into the hallways where the national press was waiting to broadcast the declaration to a country that had become obsessed with the case. The 30-year illusion was dead, the alibi was formally retracted, and the legal status of the 1996 cold case was instantly transformed from an open-ended mystery into a closed record of verified guilt. Outside the courthouse, the news of the guilty plea traveled through the crowd like an electric current, triggering an immediate shift in the energy of the plaza. The frantic, shouting cadence of the reporters broadcasting live updates was balanced by a deep, quiet stillness among the local residents who had gathered to bear witness. They stood in the freezing rain, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the heavy granite pillars of the entrance, struggling to process the speed with which the mystery had been dismantled. For 3 decades, they had nurtured a version of their history that was fluid, terrifying, and full of ghosts. In less than an hour, that history had been pinned to the floor by the rigid, unchanging reality of a judicial record. The remaining members of the victim's family sat in the front row of the gallery, their bodies perfectly still, their faces masked by an exhaustion that was ancestral in its depth. The mother did not weep. She simply held a small, silver locket between her fingers, her thumb tracing the worn edges of the metal as the court procedures continued to grind forward toward the scheduling of the final sentencing phase. There was no joy in her expression, no look of triumph or vindication. There was only the quiet, immense dignity of a survivor who had finally reached the outer edge of a long, dark forest of uncertainty. The justice being served in the room could not retroactively return the 17-year-old girl to her porch, could not erase the decades of empty chairs at the dinner table, and could not restore the innocence that the town had lost in 1996, but it had finally, irrevocably stripped the killer of his anonymity, turning his secret into his shroud. As the magistrate adjourned the session and the court officers stepped forward to escort the suspect back to the subterranean tunnel, the gallery remained seated, as if moving would break the spell of the finality they had just witnessed. The room felt different, the air less thick, the silence no longer protective of a monster but heavy with the weight of an ending. The files on the prosecutor's desk were stacked neatly, their primary purpose achieved, their charts and digital arrays having performed the necessary, surgical work of slicing through 30 years of deception. The town was still freezing under the winter sleet, the streets were still slick with ice, and the old oak tree at the corner of the lane still stood in the dark, but the shadow that had lived beneath its branches for 10,000 days had finally been brought into the light, measured, and contained by the absolute authority of the law. The formal entry of the guilty plea into the judicial record did not signal a sudden, dramatic release of tension within the county. Instead, it marked the beginning of a cold, clinical, and deeply unsettling period of administrative finality. Inside the state's maximum security processing center, a monolithic complex of chilled concrete, reinforced steel, and high-intensity biometric security arrays that sat like a gray scar on the rural landscape, the suspect was initiated into a routine designed to systematically erase his presence from the civilian world. He was no longer a person of interest, a neighbor, or a citizen hiding behind a 30-year alibi. He was a number, a physical asset to be managed, monitored, and contained until the day his biology failed him. The psychological collapse that had begun during his initial phone call from the motel room was now absolute, his physical frame slumping further into the uniform of the state as the steel door of his temporary cell slid shut with a heavy, pneumatic hiss that sounded like the definitive exhalation of time itself. Back in municipal heart of the town, the legal teams were not celebrating. They were working with an aggressive, Dawn-Dap cadence to prepare the extensive documentation required for the final sentencing hearing. The prosecution spent their days in the sterile, fluorescent-lit archives, compiling the Victim Impact Registry, a massive, multi-volume ledger that detailed the multi-generational devastation inflicted on the community since that unseasonably cold night in 1996. They weren't just collecting statements from the immediate family. They were documenting the institutional scars left on the town, interviewing retired school administrators who remembered the sudden drop in attendance, former coaches who had watched the athletic fields empty out before dusk, and neighborhood organizers whose traditional block parties had dissolved into decades of locked doors and silent, paranoid surveillance. The indictment had proven the guilt, but the sentencing documentation had to prove the sheer scope of the ruin, transforming the clinical facts of a first-degree murder into an unassailable record of a community's stolen innocence. The media coverage during this interim phase shifted into an analytical, almost academic posture, with national news networks broadcasting multi-part retrospective documentaries that dissected the mechanics of the 30-year deception. True crime analysts, forensic psychologists, and legal scholars dominated the airwaves, their digital whiteboards mapping the suspect's life with a terrifying, microscopic focus. They analyzed his employment records, his housing history, and his tax returns from the late 90s, pointing out how he had intentionally selected positions that allowed him to maintain a low profile while remaining within a 2-hour radius of the crime scene. The screens displayed a continuous loop of contrast. The grainy, low-resolution VHS footage of the 1996 search parties juxtaposed against the high-definition, stabilizing drone shots of the modern corporate parks that now bordered the deep woods. The town found itself caught in a permanent state of exposure, its past and present forced into a violent collision that left the residents feeling like specimens under a public microscope. On the streets of the suburb, the physical landscape was undergoing a quiet but radical process of purgation. The vacant lot at the corner of the lane, which had sat abandoned behind a screen of overgrown weeds and chain-link fencing since the initial investigation faltered, became the focus of an intense, community-led municipal initiative. Local authorities arrived with heavy machinery, their engines breaking the morning silence as they began to clear the debris, level the earth, and remove the decaying remnants of the old structures that had stood as an architectural shorthand for the tragedy. The residents watched from their porches, their expressions a complex mixture of relief and lingering apprehension as the dirt was turned over, exposing roots that had grown in the dark for 3 decades. They were trying to build a physical barrier between themselves and the history of 1996, to repurpose the geography of the crime into a space that could finally be integrated into the healthy, predictable routines of their current lives. Inside the Forensic Institute, the final closing reports were being compiled by the team of anthropologists who had excavated the recovery site in the deep woods. Their laboratory was a quiet, clinical sanctuary where the artifacts, the synthetic button, the fragments of blue nylon fiber, the precise soil density charts, were arranged on black velvet liners beneath protective glass casings. They were completing the final, digital catalog of the evidence, translating the molecular degradation of the materials into a series of permanent, unalterable data arrays that would be archived in the state's Supreme Judicial Repository. The lead scientist signed the final chain of custody logs with a heavy, deliberate stroke of her pen, a signature that officially transitioned the physical remains of the case from the status of active evidence to that of a completed historical record. She knew that these items would never again see the light of a courtroom, but their preservation was an absolute, moral necessity, a permanent physical witness to the fact that the earth does not lose the record of a crime. no matter how long the silence tries to protect the killer. The defense attorneys spent these weeks conducting brief, sterile consultation sessions with their client inside the fortified visitors block of the high-security facility. The meetings lacked the strategic tension of the pretrial phase. There were no more alibis to test, no more procedural loopholes to exploit, and no more digital logs to challenge. They sat across from a man who had effectively ceased to communicate, his responses limited to slow, mechanical nods of his head as they reviewed the logistics of the upcoming sentencing format. He had become a vacuum, his consciousness seemingly entirely occupied by the internal architecture of his own memory, a prisoner of the very timeline he had spent 30 years trying to outrun. The lead defense counsel recognized that the state's preparation was a total, airtight fortress, a structure where every brick was reinforced by his client's own self-incriminating data, leaving them with no recourse but to stand by as the machinery of the law reached its final, predictable destination. As the date of the sentencing hearing drew closer, the town's collective internal dialogue turned toward the concept of legacy. Conversations at the local community centers, the schools, and the libraries were no longer driven by the frantic, speculative energy of a mystery, but by a serious, grounded effort to understand how they would carry the memory of the girl into the future. They didn't want her name to remain permanently anchored to the image of the orange jumpsuit or the sterile architecture of the courthouse. They wanted to reclaim her from the criminal justice system and restore her to the social history of the town as a person who had lived, laughed, and mattered before the shadow fell. A quiet consensus emerged to establish a permanent foundation, not a monument of stone or a bronze plaque that would invite morbid tourism, but a living initiative, a multi-year scholarship directed toward young women pursuing careers in public safety, community advocacy, and forensic literacy. The final night before the sentencing arrived with a heavy, suffocating fog that rolled off the river and settled over the county, reducing the visibility to a few meters and turning the streetlights into pale, disconnected halos of amber light. Inside the precinct, the investigative team sat together in the main briefing room, the tables cluttered with the final drafts of the registry and the electronic transmittal logs. The atmosphere was devoid of the frantic, adrenaline-fueled energy that had defined the initial breakthrough. It was the quiet of a crew that had successfully brought a damaged ship into harbor after a multi-decade voyage through a storm. They checked the synchronization of the digital files one last time, ensuring that every byte of data was prepared for immediate transmission to the State Corrections Bureau the moment the judge signed the final order. They were the sentinels who had stayed awake when the rest of the world had forgotten, and as they looked out into the thick, gray mist, they knew that tomorrow would bring the absolute, irreversible termination of the 1996 nightmare. The morning of the hearing broke without light, the fog remaining dense and cold, clinging to the granite pillars of the courthouse like a shroud as the first transport vehicles arrived from the high-security processing center. The plaza was silent, the steel barricades manned by state troopers who moved with a quiet, military precision, their eyes scanning the small, stoic crowd of residents who had gathered to witness the final movement of the ledger. There were no shouts, no performative signs, and no media cameras allowed inside the main corridor. The state had stripped the proceeding of any theatrical potential, turning the sentencing into a cold, bureaucratic exercise in judicial accounting. The gallery was packed to absolute capacity, the air heavy with the scent of wet wool and the sharp, industrial tang of the building's heating system, everyone waiting in a state of suspended animation for the final strike of the gavel. When the suspect was led into the room, the silence was so total that the soft, rhythmic clicking of the court stenographer's machine sounded like a frantic pulse against the stone walls. He was seated at the center of the defense table, his eyes fixed firmly on his own folded hands, his physical presence reduced to a shadow that held no power, no mystery, and no capacity to frighten. Across the aisle, the victim's mother took her place in the front row, her posture perfectly straight, her face a mask of serene, unyielding dignity that seemed to draw the gravity of the entire room toward her. She held no photographs, no artifacts, and no physical reminders of her daughter. She was herself the monument, the living proof of a 30-year survival that was about to be validated by the highest authority of the state. The judge entered the room, her expression set in stone, and as she took her seat beneath the seal of the court, the room felt as though it were dropping into a deep, vacuum-sealed pocket of history where the past was finally about to be made permanent. The judge did not begin with a preamble, nor did she allow the atmospheric weight of the crowded gallery to dictate the cadence of her delivery. She adjusted the high halogen lamp above her bench, its sharp, white light spilling over the final pages of the state's sentencing registry with a clinical intensity that mirrored the precision of the entire investigation. Her voice, when it broke the absolute stillness of the room, carried the dry, authoritative resonance of a system that had finally run out of questions. She spoke directly to the record, her words moving with a flat, Don-Dap rhythm that stripped the proceedings of any lingering theatricality, transforming 30 years of communal torment into a series of verified legal findings. The suspect remained perfectly motionless, his shoulders hunched forward, his chin nearly touching the collar of his orange uniform, as if the sheer velocity of the judicial text were physically compressing his frame into the linoleum floor. The presentation of the victim impact statements began not with a frantic outburst of grief, but with a silent, synchronized movement of the state's digital array. The prosecutor activated the central monitors, displaying a simple, unedited list of the institutions that had been permanently altered by the events of autumn 1996. There were no low-resolution video montages or dramatic musical beds. There was only the raw, statistical accounting of a town's structural decline following the erasure of the 17-year-old girl. A representative from the municipal school board took the stand, his voice steady but carrying the heavy, generational fatigue of a man who had spent his career managing the psychological architecture of a traumatized youth. He read from historical attendance records, documenting the immediate, catastrophic drop in after-school participation, the sudden abandonment of evening athletic programs, and the multi-million-dollar emergency appropriations required to install high-intensity security lighting along every pedestrian path within a 5-mile radius of the old oak canopy. As the technical data continued to stream across the screens, the gallery sat in a state of suspended animation, the air inside the courtroom growing increasingly thick with the scent of wool coats and electronic heat. The local business council presented their findings next, detailing the long-term economic stasis that occurred when the town's vibrant, open-door evening culture was abruptly replaced by a defensive, isolationist survival strategy. Restaurants that had once thrived on midnight traffic had shuttered their doors by 8. Real estate values in the immediate vicinity of the lane had plummeted, frozen in a sepia-toned pocket of neglect as families fled the area to escape the unseen predator who they believed was hiding in the topsoil. This wasn't just an accounting of a murder, it was a comprehensive forensic evaluation of a social murder, a documentation of the precise manner in which a single, calculated act of malice can act as a corrosive agent, dissolving the trust, the prosperity, and the security of an entire region for 3 decades. The suspect's defense counsel stood only once during the entire multi-hour presentation of impact data, his intervention limited to a brief, monotone clarification regarding the chronological synchronization of the state's regional economic charts. He did not attempt to mitigate the horror of the methodology, nor did he introduce character witnesses or speculative psychological evaluations to explain the sudden, late-career collapse of his client's 30-year performance. The defense had effectively accepted the architecture of the state's cage, recognizing that any attempt to inject sentimentality or procedural obfuscation into a record reinforced by molecular biology and a taped confession would be instantly neutralized by the magistrate's uncompromising commitment to legal precision. The attorney sat back down with a slow, deliberate movement, his face a neutral mask that signaled the total, absolute exhaustion of his legal options. When the time arrived for the final, definitive statement from the victim's family, the courtroom dropped into a depth of silence that felt heavier than the granite pillars supporting the ceiling. The victim's mother did not stand to address the bench from the podium. She remained seated in the front row of the gallery, her physical proximity to the suspect across the aisle separated by less than 10 feet of open space. She did not look at the monitors, she did not look at the media logs, and she did not raise her voice above the level of a calm, conversational monotone. She spoke of her daughter not as a symbol of an international news event or a touchstone for true crime documentaries, but as a 17-year-old reality whose future had been systematically strip-mined by the individual sitting at the defense table. Her delivery lacked the frantic, screaming cadence of anger. It possessed the cold, oceanic stillness of a survivor who has outlasted the storm and is now simply documenting the high-water mark of the destruction. She described the 30 years of empty chairs at the Thanksgiving table, the graduation milestones that had been celebrated in total silence, and the permanent, agonizing presence of the what could have been that had shadowed every room of her home since 1996. She revealed that the family had never changed the locks on the front door, keeping the original mechanism from the 90s in place as a tragic, irrational testament to a hope that they knew, on a rational level, had died the moment the autumn mist settled over the lane. Her words were not an appeal for vengeance. They were a formal, public closing of an account, a ledger of human suffering presented to the state for collection. The suspect did not flinch during her delivery, his eyes remaining locked on his own folded hands, but his breathing grew shallow, the rapid, rhythmic rise and fall of his orange uniform the only indication that he was processing the finality of his exposure. The magistrate adjusted her glasses, closed the thick binders of the state's impact registry, and looked down from the bench with a focus that felt like a localized increase in atmospheric pressure. She did not deliver a grand, performative lecture on the nature of evil or the moral failures of the modern era. She spoke with the clinical, unyielding authority of the law itself. Her sentence moved with a dap, mechanical rhythm that left no room for interpretation or future legal maneuver. For the charge of first-degree murder, under the statutes of the state repository, life imprisonment. For the charge of kidnapping, to run consecutively, 25 years. For the charge of aggravated kidnapping, to run consecutively, 25 years. Without the possibility of parole, commutation, or administrative review. The words fell into the room like heavy, iron plates, each syllable sealing another section of the tomb that had been built around the suspect's future. The signing of the final order was a brief, bureaucratic ceremony, the sharp scritch of the judge's pen against the heavy bond paper amplified by the courtroom's audio system into a sound that resembled the breaking of a dry branch in the winter woods. The moment the document was indexed into the electronic system, the state troopers moved forward with a synchronized, efficient precision, lifting the suspect from his chair by his elbows and securing the additional chain links around his waist before he could make a single movement toward the exit. He was led back through the heavy security door into the subterranean tunnel, his shuffling steps and the rhythmic clinking of his iron restraints fading down the corridor until the sound was entirely swallowed by the pneumatic seals of the lower facility. He was gone, no longer a resident of the county, no longer a factor in the town's social matrix, but a closed archive, a number to be maintained in the state's permanent inventory of the condemned. The gallery remained seated for several minutes after the magistrate adjourned the session, the collective weight of the finality keeping everyone pinned to the wooden benches as the court officers began the routine process of clearing the desks and packing the digital arrays. The air in the room felt lighter, the suffocating tension that had hung over the building since the initial breakthrough days ago beginning to dissipate, replaced by the cool, neutral reality of a completed administrative process. The reporters who had spent weeks shouting live updates from the plaza outside walked out with their tablets in silence, their voices dropping into a normal, conversational register as they realized that the narrative had officially run out of variables. There were no more plot twists, no more hidden gravesides to discover, and no more alibis to unmask. The 1996 cold case had been converted into a static, unchanging record of verified guilt and absolute judicial containment. Outside, the freezing rain had stopped, leaving the plaza coated in a thin, mirroring layer of ice that reflected the pale, winter sun as it finally broke through the heavy gray clouds. The crowd of residents did not celebrate. They stood in small, quiet groups along the steel barricades, watching as the black transport vans emerged from the lower garage and accelerated toward the state highway, their tires throwing up small plumes of white mist against the cold air. The town they were returning to was exactly the same as it had been that morning, with its gleaming corporate parks, its manicured suburban lanes, and its busy commuter routes, but the internal architecture of their community had been fundamentally reset. The shadow that had lived beneath the old oak canopy for 10,000 days had been measured, calculated, and securely locked behind concrete and steel, leaving behind a clear, open horizon where the future could finally begin to grow on its own terms. The formal departure of the state transport convoy from the courthouse plaza did not trigger a sudden, cinematic celebration among the residents of the town. Instead, it marked the beginning of a quiet, internal migration away from the geography of a 30-year nightmare. As the afternoon of that definitive winter day faded into a sharp, clear twilight, the heavy media vans began the mechanical process of dismantling their satellite dishes and packing away the high-intensity floodlights that had turned the stone facade into a stage. The frantic, shouting cadence of the live broadcast was replaced by the ordinary, rhythmic hum of commuter traffic and the sound of dry leaves scraping across the frozen asphalt. The 1996 cold case was no longer a fluid, terrifying mystery that could warp the identity of any stranger or neighbor. It had been converted into a static, unchanging volume of court-admissible data, signed, sealed, and locked away in the state's permanent repository of justice. Inside the precinct, the investigative team sat in the main briefing room, surrounded by the physical detritus of their long-term victory. The tables were cluttered with empty coffee cups, discarded thermal wrappers, and the final transmittal logs from the electronic booking system. There was no explosive outburst of relief among the detectives, but rather a profound, oceanic exhaustion that seemed to settle into the very marrow of their bones. The lead investigator, a man who had inherited the file when its pages were already yellowing with age, walked over to the central whiteboard where the suspect's timeline had been mapped in sharp, aggressive strokes of black ink. With a single, deliberate movement of a cloth, he erased the headings, the arrows, and the coordinates, reducing 30 years of investigative frustration to a cloud of gray dust that settled onto the linoleum floor. The file was closed, the names had been verified, and the department's most persistent ghost had finally been stripped of its power to haunt. In the weeks that followed the final sentencing, the town began the painful, necessary work of recontextualizing its own social history. The revelation that the killer was not a passing drifter or a monster from a distant city, but an ordinary, quiet individual who had shared their markets, attended their town meetings, and walked his dog down their tree-lined streets, forced a collective reevaluation of every domestic routine. Neighbors looked across their hedges not with the frantic, acute paranoia of 1996, but with a serious, grounded awareness of the complexity of the human landscape. They were learning to build a new kind of community, one that was not based on the naive, fragile assumption of suburban innocence, but on an active, intentional commitment to mutual vigilance and mutual support. The silence that had once protected the predator was being systematically dismantled by the sheer force of their shared presence, their open communication, and their refusal to let isolation take root in their neighborhoods. The physical site of the tragedy, the dark corner beneath the old oak canopy, underwent a quiet, institutional transformation overseen by the municipal council. The overgrown brush was cleared away by city workers, the ground was leveled, and a simple, unadorned pedestrian path was installed, flanked by low-voltage, solar-powered safety arrays that illuminated the space from dusk until dawn. There were no grand monuments erected, no historical markers designed to attract true crime tourism or perpetuate the morbid energy of the act. Instead, the town chose to reclaim the space for the living. Parents began walking their children past the corner on their way to the school athletic fields. Runners integrated the lane into their daily morning routines, and the old oak tree, which had stood for 3 decades as a silent witness to an act of absolute malice, was restored to its proper place as a simple, beautiful feature of the suburban landscape, its shadow no longer holding a secret. Inside the state's forensic center, the artifacts from the 1996 excavation, the synthetic button, the microscopic blue nylon fibers, and the pristine, digital charts of the soil matrix were moved from the active examination tables into the high-security historical archive. The technicians who had worked with a reverent, terrified focus to decode the molecular evidence compiled their final procedural manuals, documenting every step of the genetic sequencing and genealogical modeling that had broken the case. This wasn't just the closure of a file. It was the creation of a textbook, a permanent masterclass in scientific persistence that would be studied by generations of analysts to come. Every time a new technician entered the vault, they would look at the 1996 repository not as a monument to a failure, but as a testament to the fact that time is not an absolute barrier to justice, and that the Earth does not lose the record of a crime, no matter how deep it is buried. The perpetrator's initiation into the state's maximum security correctional facility marked the absolute, permanent termination of his civilian identity. Stripped of his name, his possessions, and the carefully managed alibi that had sustained his ego for 30 years, he was reduced to a singular, administrative line in the state's inventory of the condemned. His daily existence was now defined by the rigid, mechanical parameters of a high-security environment, a world of concrete surfaces, automated sliding gates, and the constant, cold glare of closed-circuit biometric cameras. He had spent an entire adult life running from the reality of his actions, manipulating the perceptions of those around him to maintain an illusion of ordinary respectability, but the law had finally built a structure from which there was no escape. He was a ghost in his own life, an aging nonentity whose heartbeat was monitored by a system that treated him with the clinical indifference he had earned through his own calculated cruelty. For the remaining members of the victim's family, the post-trial era brought a quiet, agonizingly slow return to a state of equilibrium. The mother, whose dignified presence in the front row of the gallery had anchored the moral weight of the entire courtroom, returned to her home with a small box of personal artifacts the detectives had returned to her. She did not create a shrine or lock the house in a permanent state of mourning. Instead, she began the difficult, noble work of integrating the truth into her daily existence. The empty chair at the dinner table was still there, the loss was still permanent, and the decades of missed milestones could never be restored, but the suffocating, grinding pressure of the unanswered question had vanished. She could finally remember her daughter not as a missing person poster or a headline in an international news feed, but as the 17-year-old girl who had lived, laughed, and brought light into their lives before the darkness intervened. The town's civic organizations channeled the collective energy of the resolution into the formal establishment of the multi-year scholarship fund that had been proposed during the final days of the trial. Managed by a board of local educators, retired investigators, and community leaders, the foundation was designed to act as a living legacy for the girl whose potential had been violently paused in 1996. The initiative was directed towards supporting young women pursuing advanced degrees in forensic science, criminal law, and community advocacy, turning the structural lessons of the tragedy into a permanent engine for public safety and social justice. Every year, when the awards were announced at the high school commencement ceremony, the presentation was conducted with a quiet, solemn grace that focused entirely on the future, proving that the ultimate answer to an act of destruction is the systematic cultivation of progress and opportunity. As the months continued to roll forward, transitioning the winter ice into the soft, vibrant greens of a new spring, the town arrived at a state of maturity that it had never possessed during its era of superficial innocence. The residents had looked directly into the absolute worst aspect of human nature. They had witnessed the catastrophic collapse of a household, and they had felt the profound violation of a homegrown betrayal, but they had also witnessed the undeniable power of truth, science, and human persistence. They were a community that had been broken, but in the process of putting the pieces back together, they had discovered a structural strength that could withstand the passage of time. They were no longer afraid of the dark because they had learned exactly how to bring the light, and as they looked toward the open horizon of their future, they did so with a stride that was steady, confident, and entirely, beautifully their own. The progression of the seasons into the height of the summer of 2026 brought with it a profound, almost perceptible lightening of the air across the entire municipal district. The year 1996, which had for 3 decades functioned as an unyielding, frozen anchor of unresolved terror, had finally been wrestled into the permanent, immutable confines of a historical archive. The town had traveled an extraordinary psychological distance since that freezing winter morning when the headline, "Justice After 30 Years," cold case solved as prime suspect confesses, had first flashed across the screens of its residents. It was a community that was no longer waiting for a shoe to drop, no longer looking at the quiet spaces between its modern suburban developments with the chronic, low-frequency anxiety of a population haunted by an unidentified predator. The narrative of the 17-year-old girl who had walked into the autumn mist had finally achieved its definitive, legal, and structural conclusion. The physical terrain of the neighborhood reflected this transition from a landscape of trauma to one of absolute restoration. The pedestrian path that replaced the overgrown lot beneath the old oak canopy had become a seamless, natural feature of the town's daily life. The low-voltage safety arrays hummed quietly at night, casting a steady, warm amber glow that erased the deep, predatory shadows that had once defined the corner for 10,000 days. Children rode their bicycles past the tree without a sudden acceleration of their pace. Parents pushed strollers along the clean asphalt with a sense of calm that was both deliberate and unforced, and the tree itself, its leaves of vibrant, deep green against the summer sky, seemed to have been restored to the simplicity of its biological existence. It was no longer a monument to a crime or a shorthand symbol for failure of justice. It was simply a tree, providing shade to a generation that was growing up in a world that was fundamentally safer, more transparent, and more connected than the one their parents had known. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere had settled into the quiet, rhythmic efficiency of a department that had successfully balanced its most difficult ledger. The retired investigators who had spent half their careers chasing the ghost of 1996 were now frequent, relaxed visitors to the station, their presence no longer marked by the desperate, grinding urgency of men looking for a needle in a haystack of dead ends. They would sit in the lounge with the younger detectives, sharing stories over cups of fresh coffee, their insights focused on the long-term methodology of persistence rather than the acute frustration of a cold file. The case had become the structural backbone of the department's training curriculum, a living demonstration that an uncompromising commitment to the truth, when combined with the systematic application of modern science, is an unstoppable force against the passage of time. The current officers handled their daily, routine tasks with a heightened sense of professional pride, knowing that they were the stewards of a legacy that had redefined the standards of justice for the entire region. In the state's high-security forensic archive, the 1996 repository had officially been classified as a completed historical masterclass. The synthetic button, the microscopic blue nylon fibers, and the pristine digital maps of the forest soil density were housed in protective nitrogen-purged chambers, their physical and structural integrity preserved with a level of care typically reserved for foundational state documents. Legal scholars, forensic anthropologists, and investigative genealogists from across the nation frequently requested access to the digital logs, studying the precise manner in which the team had converted a sudden, motel room phone call into an airtight, unassailable legal fortress. The file was a monument to the fact that biology does not lie, that the earth does not forget, and that the molecular signatures of an act of violence will always wait patiently for the technology of the future to decode them and drag the perpetrator into the light. The perpetrator, now deep within the multi-decade monotony of his life sentence at the state maximum security complex, had effectively been erased from the social and cultural matrix of the community he had once paralyzed with his deception. He was a non-entity, an administrative line item in a digital ledger that was updated with the cold, bureaucratic indifference of a machine tracking inventory. The walls of his cell were the final, physical realization of the cage he had spent 30 years constructing through his alibis and his lies. He held no mystery, no power, and no capacity to inspire fear. He was simply an aging inmate whose life was defined by the rigid parameters of an institution that treated his existence as a closed record. The town had deleted him from its daily thoughts, finding that the ultimate victory over his calculated cruelty was not a perpetual hatred, but a total, permanent indifference that allowed his memory to dissolve like smoke in the wind. The remaining members of the victim's family had moved into a space of hard-won, serene grace that served as the quiet moral anchor for the entire town. The mother, whose face had for 30 years been a symbol of an unhealed public wound, spent her summer days in the quiet sanctuary of her garden, her movements unhurried, her expressions defined by a peace that was deep and unshakable. She had not forgotten her daughter, nor had the passage of time erased the sharp, permanent contours of her loss, but the suffocating, grinding weight of the unresolved mystery had been lifted from her shoulders. She had achieved what few survivors of such profound betrayal ever truly find, a state of closure that was not about forgetting the tragedy, but about integrating the truth into a life that was still capable of experiencing beauty, connection, and purpose. The small box of recovered artifacts sat on a high shelf in her home, a quiet, private testament to a daughter who had been loved, whose absence had been mourned, and whose memory had finally been vindicated by the highest authority of the state. The scholarship foundation established in the girl's name had grown into a vital, permanent institution that was actively reshaping the future of the region's youth. The funds, managed with an aggressive, forward-looking discipline by a board of local educators and community leaders, had already provided multi-year grants to dozens of young women entering advanced programs in forensic science, criminal justice, and public safety advocacy. Every year, during the high school commencement ceremony, the announcement of the recipients was conducted with a quiet, solemn dignity that focused entirely on the potential, the ambitions, and the capabilities of the next generation. It was a living, breathing response to an act of absolute destruction, a systematic cultivation of progress and opportunity that proved that the ultimate legacy of the 1996 tragedy was not the darkness of the forest, but the persistent, expanding light of the community's resilience. As the summer weeks continued to roll forward, transforming the warm twilight into the crisp, clean mornings of a new season, the town looked toward the horizon with a gaze that was entirely unburdened by the ghosts of its past. They were a community that had looked directly into the absolute worst aspect of human nature. They had witnessed the catastrophic collapse of a household, and they had felt the profound violation of a homegrown betrayal, but they had also witnessed the undeniable, majestic power of truth and human persistence. They were no longer the naive, fragile suburb of 1996, nor were they the panicked, reactionary population of the post-arrest phase. They were a mature, sophisticated, and deeply connected society that had learned exactly how to carry its history without letting it dictate the scope of its future. The cold case was solved, the ledger was balanced, and the town was finally, truly, at home in the brilliant, unhurried light of its own restoration. The midsummer sun of 2026 reached its zenith over the municipal district, casting a brilliant, unfiltered light across a landscape that had finally, irrevocably freed itself from the architectural and psychological prisons of the past. The year 1996, which had for 30 years acted as a black hole in the town's collective history, swallowing up its sense of security and replacing its innocence with a chronic, low-frequency dread, had vanished from the active headlines. The transformation was not merely a matter of passing time. It was a structural overhaul of how the community processed its own reality. The narrative of the 17-year-old girl who had walked into the autumn mist was no longer a weapon used by the dark to terrify the living. It had been converted into a foundational lesson in the absolute, majestic power of forensic science and human persistence. The town had marched through a multi-decade desert of unanswered questions and had emerged on the other side with a social fabric that was stronger, more resilient, and more deeply integrated than anything its founders had ever envisioned. At the physical heart of this total restoration was the pedestrian corridor that now ran seamlessly past the old oak tree at the corner of the lane. The geography of the space had been completely purged of its predatory history, the overgrown brush and decaying fences replaced by a clean, open pathway that invited the daily, unhurried routines of the neighborhood. At night, the solar-powered safety arrays hummed with a quiet, reassuring efficiency, casting a steady amber glow that left no room for the deep, suffocating shadows that had once hidden a monster for 10,000 days. The residents no longer walked past the tree with that tight, subconscious acceleration of pace that had characterized their movements for a generation. Children laughed as they rode their bicycles beneath its wide canopy, Runners tracked their splits as they transitioned through the intersection, and the tree itself, its leaves rustling softly in the warm summer breeze, stood simply as a beautiful feature of the natural world, its branches no longer carrying the crushing weight of a 30-year secret. Inside the municipal precinct, the changes were equally profound, reflecting a department that had successfully balanced its most difficult ledger and redeemed its greatest historical failure. The current investigative teams operated with a level of professional confidence that was directly tied to the success of the 1996 resolution. The digital archives held the complete, unassailable record of the breakthrough. The audio files of the suspect's motel confessional, the molecular sequencing of the recovered nylon fibers, and the pristine geographic charts that had turned an old, yellowing cold file into an airtight legal fortress. The case was no longer a source of nagging shame or institutional frustration for the officers. It was the standard-bearer for their training protocols, a living masterclass that demonstrated to every new recruit that the passage of time is an irrelevant variable when confronted with an uncompromising dedication to the truth. The precinct had transformed its trauma into a structure of absolute operational excellence, ensuring that the lessons of the past were actively protecting the stability of the present. In the state's high-security forensic laboratory, the artifacts extracted from the clay matrix of the deep woods were treated with a level of reverence typically reserved for historical treaties or constitutional documents. The synthetic button and the microscopic fragments of blue fabric remained housed in protective, climate-controlled chambers, their preservation monitored by automated biometric systems to ensure that the physical record of the crime remained pristine for the rest of history. The data arrays generated during the investigation, the genealogical models, the soil density charts, and the precise chronological mapping of the suspect's 30-year movements were accessed continuously by legal scholars and investigative agencies from across the country. Yen Fong had become a blueprint for the nation, a concrete example of how a community can utilize the precision of modern biology and the relentlessness of localized law enforcement to reach back through 3 decades of silence and drag a predator into the unforgiving light of justice. The perpetrator, now completely absorbed into the gray, monolithic isolation of the state's maximum security penitentiary, had ceased to have any resonance within the community he had once paralyzed with his deception. He was an aging nonentity, an administrative line item in an inventory of the condemned that was updated with the cold, unblinking efficiency of a computer tracking digital assets. The rigid, concrete parameters of his cell were the absolute, permanent destination of a path he had chosen to walk in the autumn of 1996, a physical manifestation of the cage he had spent his entire adult life building out of false alibis and calculated lies. The town had moved past the phase of active anger, discovering that the most complete victory over his malice was a total, permanent indifference. He held no mystery, no power, and no capacity to inspire a single moment of fear. His name was a footnote in a closed record, his memory dissolving into the background noise of history while the town he tried to break continued to grow, innovate, and thrive in his absence. The remaining members of the victim's family carried their history into this new era with a quiet, majestic grace that had become the moral center of the entire neighborhood. The mother, whose unyielding dignity in the front row of the courtroom had anchored the legal finale of the case, spent her summer mornings tending to the vibrant blooms of her garden, her face reflecting a serenity that was as deep as it was hard-won. The loss of her 17-year-old daughter was still a permanent feature of her landscape, the empty chair at her table an unchanging reality that no judicial verdict could ever retroactively alter, but the suffocating, grinding agony of the unresolved mystery had been lifted from her shoulders forever. She had achieved a profound state of closure, a reclamation of her own life that was not about erasing the tragedy, but about anchoring her daughter's memory in the permanent, beautiful light of the truth, free from the distorted shadows of a killer's long-held secret. The educational and civic foundations established in the girl's name had matured into permanent, high-functioning engines of community progress, actively reshaping the ambitions of the town's youth. The multi-year scholarship fund, managed with an aggressive, Forward-looking discipline by a board of local educators and community advocates had already provided substantial academic grants to dozens of young women pursuing advanced degrees in forensic literacy, public safety, and victim advocacy. Every year, during the high school commencement exercises, the presentation of these awards was conducted with a solemn, forward-facing pride that turned the memory of a 30-year tragedy into a catalyst for future innovation and social justice. The initiative was a living, breathing proof of the town's resilience, a systematic cultivation of opportunity that demonstrated that the ultimate answer to an act of absolute destruction is the deliberate, unyielding creation of value and light for the generations to come. As the long summer days began their slow, natural transition into the crisp, clean twilights of the late season, the town looked out toward its horizon with a gaze that was entirely unburdened by the ghosts of its past. The residents had looked directly into the absolute darkest depths of human betrayal. They had lived through the catastrophic unraveling of their suburban illusions, and they had felt the visceral shock of a homegrown malice, but they had also stood witness to the absolute, unstoppable triumph of human persistence and scientific truth. They were no longer the fragile, naive population of 1996, nor were they the reactionary, panicked community of the post-arrest phase. They were a mature, highly sophisticated, and deeply connected society that knew exactly who they were because they knew exactly what they had survived. The cold case was closed, the ledger was balanced, and the town was finally, truly, at peace within the brilliant, unhurried light of its own permanent restoration. The arrival of late August in 2026 brought with it an unseasonably cool breeze that rustled the dense green canopy of the old oak tree, casting a mosaic of shifting sunlight and shadow across the clean asphalt of the pedestrian path below. For the residents of this municipal district, the passage of 10 full years since the dramatic culmination of the 1996 cold case had turned what was once an acute, paralyzing trauma into a monument of collective resilience and historical finality. The town had long since ceased to be defined by the headlines that had once stripped it of its suburban anonymity. Instead, it had become a living template for how a community can look directly into the abyss of a homegrown betrayal and rebuild its social architecture from the ground up. The frantic, dawn-dap rhythm of the news cycles that accompanied the headline, "Justice After 30 Years," cold case solved as prime suspect confesses, had settled into the deep, quiet, and unchanging frequencies of an administrative record. At the physical and psychological center of this new era were the retired investigators who had once carried the physical weight of the 1996 file folders like a permanent shackle around their professional lives. These men and women, whose faces had been etched with the lines of systemic frustration during the long decades of dead ends and false leads, were now the quiet elders of the community. They could be found on any given morning sitting on the benches of the pedestrian corridor, watching a new generation of children walk toward the high school athletic fields without a single trace of the chronic, low-frequency anxiety that had dictated suburban life in the late 90s. Their conversations were no longer driven by the mechanical parameters of evidence logs or the psychological dissection of the suspect's alibi. They spoke of the town's current prosperity, the stability of their families, and the profound, silent satisfaction of a debt that had been paid in full to the highest standards of the law. They had stood in the silence until the truth spoke back to them, and that truth had granted them a peace that time could never corrode. In the state's high-security Supreme Judicial Repository, the 1996 file had officially transitioned from an active criminal case to a legendary foundational text studied by every investigative agency in the country. The digital arrays that documented the breakthrough, the precise audio frequencies of the suspect's motel room confessional, the molecular sequencing of the synthetic button, and the high-definition geographic maps of the clay matrix within the deep woods served as the gold standard for modern forensic literacy. New analysts entering the facility were brought to the 1996 archive not to witness a tragedy, but to study a masterclass in forensic persistence. The file stood as an absolute, unassailable fortress of methodology, a proof that the molecular signatures of an act of violence do not dissolve under the pressure of 30 winters, and that the system, when driven by an uncompromising dedication to the truth, will always possess the capacity to reach back through the decades and rewrite the final chapter of a stolen life. The perpetrator, completely isolated within the gray, monolithic architecture of the state's maximum security penitentiary, had effectively undergone a total social and cultural erasure from the world he had once manipulated with his deception. He was an aging nonentity, a multi-digit tracking number in an automated inventory of the condemned, his daily existence reduced to the sterile, unyielding parameters of a high-security cell block. The walls that contained him were the absolute, permanent realization of the psychological cage he had built out of false alibis and calculated lies since that unseasonably cold autumn night in 1996. The town had moved completely past the phase of active anger, discovering that the ultimate victory over his malice was not a perpetual, energy-consuming hatred, but an absolute, permanent indifference. He held no mystery, no lingering capacity to inspire fear, and no resonance within the community. His memory had been systematically dismantled and neutralized by the sheer force of the truth, leaving him to age into a historical ghost while the town he tried to paralyze continued to innovate, thrive, and look toward the future. The remaining members of the victim's family carried their history into this 10-year anniversary milestone with a quiet, majestic grace that had become the moral compass for the entire neighborhood. The mother, whose unyielding and serene presence in the front row of the gallery had anchored the legal finale of the trial, spent her summer afternoons tending to the deep, vibrant roots of her garden, her face reflecting a clarity that was as deep as it was hard-won. The loss of her 17-year-old daughter remained an unchanging feature of her internal landscape, an empty space that no judicial verdict or forensic confirmation could ever retroactively fill, but the suffocating, grinding pressure of the unanswered question had been lifted from her shoulders forever. She had achieved a state of complete, unburdened closure, a reclamation of her own narrative that allowed her to remember her daughter not as a missing person poster or a true crime headline, but as the brilliant, laughing reality who had brought light into their lives before the darkness intervened. The civic and educational foundations established in the girl's name had matured into permanent, high-functioning engines of social justice and regional progress, actively reshaping the ambitions of the town's youth. The multi-year scholarship fund, managed with an aggressive, forward-looking discipline by a board of local educators and community advocates, had already provided substantial academic grants to dozens of young women pursuing advanced degrees in forensic anthropology, public safety, and victim advocacy. Every year, during the high school commencement exercises, the presentation of these awards was conducted with a solemn, forward-facing pride that turned the memory of a 30-year tragedy into a catalyst for future innovation and public safety. The initiative stood as a living, breathing proof of the town's resilience, a systematic cultivation of opportunity that demonstrated that the ultimate answer to an act of absolute destruction is the deliberate, unyielding creation of value, clarity, and opportunity for the generations to come. As the long summer days of 2026 began their slow, natural transition into the crisp, clean twilights of the late season, the town looked out toward its open horizon with a gaze that was entirely unburdened by the phantoms of its past. The residents had looked directly into the absolute darkest depths of human betrayal. They had lived through the catastrophic collapse of their suburban illusions, and they had felt the visceral shock of a homegrown malice, but they had also stood witness to the absolute, unstoppable triumph of human persistence and scientific truth. They were no longer the fragile, naive population of 1996, nor were they the reactionary, panicked community of the post-arrest phase. They were a mature, highly sophisticated, and deeply connected society that knew exactly who they were because they knew exactly what they had survived. The cold case was closed, the ledger was balanced, and the town was finally, truly, and permanently at peace within the brilliant, unhurried light of its own magnificent restoration.